My name is McMichael, and today I'm going to talk about Holocene, or the last 10,000 years, increases in palm communities in the Amazon. So I'd like to thank Dawn for giving this nice perspective on time, which fits very well, and Nicola as well for introducing the idea that some of these trees can live for hundreds or thousands of years. And so this is Amazonian forest. Many of you have maybe been there or maybe seen them. They're quite immense, 6 million kilometers squared actually of these forests. They hold about 40% of Earth's known biodiversity. They also hold about 17% of terrestrial carbon stocks. So as you can imagine then, these forests play quite an important role in global climate and vegetation models and understanding the Earth's response to rising CO2 levels. And many of you have maybe seen on the news lately that these things are also on fire right now, which ties in with this talk about long-term fire in the Amazon. And so we'll start with just asking a basic question. What do we know ecologically about the Amazonian rainforest here? In 2013, the first large synthesis of ecological data in Amazonia came out by Hans Tersteja and colleagues. And what he did was he synthesized the distributions and the relative abundances and species richness of plants across 1,170 forest plots in the Amazon basin. You can see these located as blue or orange dots here on the map. So most of these forest plots were about 1 hectare in size that they studied. And so from these 1,100 forest plots, they estimated that across the entirety of the 6 million kilometers squared forest, that there were about 4 billion individual trees, and there were over 16,000 tree species in this forest. And it was nice to see Alexandra put the diagram of the UK up beside Amazonia to see exactly how large these forests are. So what Hans and colleagues found that was really interesting within these forests is a pattern called Amazonian hyperdominance. And so of the 4 billion estimated trees in the Amazon rainforest, a tiny, tiny percentage of them, only 227 out of the 16,000 species, actually account for half of those individual trees in the forest. So you've got 227 out of 16,000 species accounting for half of all individual trees in Amazonia. This, of course, relates strongly to biodiversity, but carbon storage is also a function of relative species abundance. So these hyperdominant trees, or these hyperdominant assemblages, are then playing a very large role in carbon sinking and carbon sourcing in Amazonia. So ecologists have spent many years thinking about why are the tropics, or why is Amazonia so species rich, and what drives the relative abundances and distributions of these species and these individuals. And this is just a list of what many ecological papers have come across: long-term evolution and ecological processes, random processes, biotic interactions between individuals and between species, and environmental gradients. But in the last several years, there's been another hypothesis to come up and to be presented, which is that people, or people that lived in Amazonia prior to European arrival, actually created some of this pattern of hyperdominance that we see today. Because these trees can live, most Amazonian trees can live for several hundred years, and so the pre-European inhabitants of Amazonia may have played a huge role in structuring the relative abundances of these species and these individuals. So that's what I'll look at today. Over the last 2 years, there's been several high-impact publications to come out on this idea that preColumbian people actually affected or influenced what we see in Amazonian forests today. So one was by myself up at the top. My colleague Carolina Levis put one in Science. And the third one, the impact of preColumbian geoglyph builders on Amazonian forests. Now, all three of these get around the idea that people have structured these forests over long time scales, and this is mainly through fire. These forests are super wet, and most of them don't burn naturally. And this is also, these ideas were put forth because of plant domestication and agricultural practices that were going on in several regions of Amazonia before European arrival. We actually have evidence of maize cultivation in some of these systems as far as 6,000 years ago. And so today's talk is to look to see if these effects are seen everywhere in the Amazon. Here's a map of annual precipitation of Amazonia. And you can see that the northwest pieces of Amazonia have 4,000 to 5,000 millimeters of rain per year, so these are really wet forests. Where in these southern rims and peripheries, it's still very wet considering what we know in Europe and the US, but it's a bit drier in those forests. So did these past human influences, this fire and this cultivation, did it affect the entire 6 million kilometers squared? Or is it differential across the basin? Now, most of those papers that I showed you in the previous slide that talk about preColumbian impacts in Amazonia, most of it comes from this drier region in the southern and the eastern portions. And so today I'm going to take you into a very wet part of Amazonia in Colombia. AMA is just short for McMichael, which is a well-studied 25-hectare forest plot in the Amazon. And we did long-term fire and vegetation reconstructions from here to see, is there evidence of people? And if so, how did they influence vegetation change over long time scales? So I went out into these forests with a group of students and we collected soils. You can see here in the top image, we use a little auger and we drill holes all across Amazonia and we pull up the soils about to 1 meter depth. And we replicate this across the plot, and then we replicate plots across regions and then regions across the Amazon. And what we look for as evidence of people is charcoal, which indicates fire. And again, these forests are so wet that they're not burning naturally, so we can then associate people and fire together. The second line of evidence that we use to look for human activities are these things called phytoliths. And how many of you know what a phytolith is? Very few, so I'll explain. So plants uptake silica from the soils, and they build these structures called phytoliths, and the phytoliths become part of the plant tissue itself. So it's in leaves and in trunks and in stems of some, but not all plants. So when a plant dies and decays, all of the organic components decay away. The silica bits remain in the soils, and they can preserve there for thousands of years. And so then we can use these little pieces of silica, which are usually associated with a specific plant type, in this example, a palm tree. And we can use these phytoliths to then make vegetation reconstruction through time in soils across Amazonia. And the most commonly used thing is pollen, but pollen does not preserve in these very wet soils. So we looked at charcoal abundances and distributions, and we looked at phytolith abundances and distributions in this forest plot in Colombia called McMichael. And just as a summary here, here's the fire results. So we did over 40 soil cores across this plot, and we could only find 7 pieces of charcoal that were large enough to get a date on so that we could actually see when these fires occurred. Now we need only a piece of charcoal about as large or smaller than my pinky fingernail to actually get a date on these things, and we could only find 7 of these across a 25-hectare plot. The dates that we did get show that there was more fire activity around 2,600 years ago and more fire activity around 1,600 years ago. And this was definitely because of human activity. But one thing I want you to notice on this diagram is that it ends at 1,500 years ago. There's no fire in the last 1,600 years in this plot in Colombia. So it has not burned. That doesn't mean to say people were not in this landscape at this point. So if I want to show you the phytolith reconstructions, it'll take me a second to walk you through this diagram. So on the x-axis, we have depth of the soil cores. And the 10 soil cores that I'm showing you here, their names are lined up across the top here. The bottom x-axis here is phytolith abundance. The 7 pieces of charcoal that we found are indicated here with either an asterisk or a plus, and so you can see at what depth and how many soil cores that these pieces of charcoal were found in. And And the colors represent phytolith types. Now, I made a summary diagram of groupings so that I wouldn't give you specifics on this palm and this palm and this tree and this tree. So what you see in the gray here, the gray things are the changes in arboreal taxa or trees through time. The purple indicates, the light green are a type of disturbance tree. So these are our disturbance trees or early pioneer type trees through time. The two purple colors are palms, two different types of palms, palm groups. And you can also see their change through time as you go up would be the modern samples. So depth 0 is modern, and depth 75 or 80 is the older sediments. And one thing I think that's pretty clear in most of these soil core diagrams is that the purples increase, or the palms increase, as you go towards the modern setting. If you look a little bit closer, you can see that the palm increases are actually higher on the left-hand side of the diagram. And those are the cores where we had the least evidence of fire and the least evidence of open forest or grasses. So our grasses here, grass phytoliths, are indicated with a black circle. And grasses in Amazonian forests mean that the forest has been opened or cleared for either agriculture, crop growing, or natural canopy gap dynamics, of course. And so we see no evidence. We see less than 1% of grass phytoliths in every single sample that we looked at. I think we saw a total of about 10 total grass phytoliths altogether. So these forests have never been opened on large spatial scales through the Holocene. And they've never experienced fire that covered the whole plot. In this diagram, you'll also maybe or maybe not notice that some things are missing. We can identify maize and other cultivars regularly, quite easily in phytolith records. And there was 0 sign of maize, 0 sign of manioc, or 0 sign of any cultivar within this plot. There was also 0 sign of heliconia, which is a plant that also loves disturbances and light gaps. So we do not have a forest opening, nor cultivation, and very little evidence of fire in this system. But we do see this really strong palm increase. And so I want to put that in the context of other sites across the Amazon. Now what you see on the map here is the site I just showed you, McMichael up in Colombia, in comparison with 4 other sites. A forest plot near Manaus, that's MAN, 2 forest plots in the southwestern Amazon, Cochacashu and Los Amigos, and the TEO in Brazil. This is actually an archaeological site that I'll give you for comparison. So this is not a forest plot. We know people were here. We know they were cultivating maize, and they were also enriching palm trees because palm trees are quite useful to people, both their seeds, their fruits, their nuts. This is one of the most useful plant groups in the Amazon. And so I'll show you how the fire regimes and how the vegetation changed between our site and McMichael with these other forest plots and with an archaeological site to kind of put it in perspective. And so I'll start with the fire records. The archaeological site, I'll tell you ahead of time, has continuous fire for 3,000 years. So there's no need for me to show you a diagram of that one. It is charcoal from top to bottom of all archaeological pits and all soil profiles dug, completely full of charcoal. So continuous burning. The forest plots where we study all of this biodiversity information and all these carbon storage information have very different fire histories. So our McMichael, our Colombian one, is at the top. No fire in 1,600 years. Very, very different from Manaus, which had quite a bit of fire around 1,000 years ago, and also has some fire in the modern context. Cochacashu down in the south, in some of those little wet pockets that you see in southern Amazonia, has no fire except for 600 and 900 years ago. And Los Amigos probably has the most frequent and intensive fire history, which is right beside Cochacashu, actually, for 4,000 years and has a lot of modern disturbance found in those soils as well. So McMichael, sitting up in the northwest part of the Amazon, is by far the least disturbed forest that we've surveyed so far as its fire history goes. So what about the vegetation change? I'm focusing on palms here because, like I mentioned a second ago, palms are the most useful plant group in the Amazon and were known to be enriched by certain people. So people grew palm orchards for either construction purposes or to get the fruits from them. So the changes in phytoliths, the top panel here shows you the changes in phytoliths from the bottom to the top. So it shows you that palm increases in McMichael, which is on the far left, actually match what we see at Teotonio, the archaeological site. So they can be just as large. These palm increases at McMichael, which have no evidence of people, are acting the same as the palm increases that we see where we have 3,000 years of constant burning and people, where our other forest plots don't show at all that increase in palm abundances through time. The bottom panel shows you kind of the same thing. It's just the magnitude of change within a soil core. Teotonio had almost no palms in the base of its core. That's our archaeological site. And as soon as you see people and fire start, the palm abundances increase exponentially. McMichael with no people or no fire for 1,600 years also had similar abundance increases in these palm taxa. And so I think that the take-home message would be that these significant palm increases in McMichael, they were stronger than all of our other forest plot data where we do have evidence of fire. And they almost reach the magnitude of what we see in an archaeological site, but because there's no forest opening, there's no fire, there's no cultivation associated with it, it does not appear to be caused by past human activity. And I will caveat this slide for 1 second because I forgot one word, caused by direct past human activity. So this was not people in this landscape actively growing palms. We're still looking to see if this could be indirect human activity. There could have been an archaeological site 5 kilometers away from McMichael, and they could have been growing and cultivating 5 kilometers away. The indirect cause could be hunting. So as you hunt a landscape, and early pre-Columbian people were actively hunting the landscape, you change seed dispersal and you change seed regeneration. And so we're still looking to see whether indirect human activity or this change in seed dispersals caused by hunting could be affecting, or could be why we see this pattern at McMichael that does not seem to be directly related with people. And so I basically showed you one example, one forest plot. This is 25 hectares out of 6 million kilometers squared forest, so just N of 1 so far. And this was funded by Center for Tropical Forest Science and Forest Geo, but I also want to announce to a nice group of plant people that I also got the news a few days ago that I have now an ERC grant to carry this out across the entirety of Amazonia. And so I will be hiring PhD students and postdocs within the next few months to do work similar as this in other parts of the Amazon to try and piece together the differences in space and time and these relationships with plants and people across this Amazonian landscape. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for your time.